It started not with a fight, not with a betrayal, but with silence. A kind of silence that wasn't born from confusion or absence, but from clarity. Everyone talks about the moment love begins, but no one prepares you for the moment it shifts. He didn't storm out. He didn't scream. He just stood there, as she tested him again like she always did, searching for that crack she could crawl into and twist. But this time, his eyes didn't flinch. He looked at her like a man who'd already grieved something she hadn't even lost yet. That's when she realized he wasn't going to beg this time. She had mastered the art of subtle control, not with force, but with feelings. Tears dropped like hints, silences sharpened like blades. She'd dated men who crumbled at the sound of disapproval, who explained themselves in essays, who ran through emotional hoops just to be understood. But this man, he listened without leaning in. He didn't chase closure. He didn't chase her. When she turned cold, he turned calm, and that terrified her more than any raised voice ever could. He wasn't angry. He was aware. And nothing is more dangerous than a man who feels deeply and still chooses restraint. Most people assume a man who doesn't react doesn't care, but it's the opposite. He cared enough to build himself into someone whose emotions weren't weapons or wounds. He had felt the sting of manipulation before, and rather than building walls, he built understanding. He didn't respond to every jab because he knew what she was doing. Not maliciously, maybe not even consciously, but she was trying to find out if he needed her more than he needed himself. And for the first time in her life, she was facing someone who didn't. Someone who could love her, fully, without surrendering his spine. She threw out comments designed to sting, passive-aggressive, lines about his career, his past, his pace. Most men would have explained, defended, or dissolved. He just tilted his head and said, "Interesting," then went on as if nothing happened. Not because he didn't hear it, but because he knew what it was. A test she didn't know she was. Failing. This wasn't arrogance. It was self-possession, a kind of internal stillness that couldn't be bought or begged for. And it made her feel something she hadn't expected. Vulnerable. Because for once, her emotions weren't the loudest thing in the room. She tried again. Colder this time. Delays in texts. Deliberate distance. Hoping he'd lean forward just a little, hoping he'd break pattern and beg for reconnection. But he didn't. He noticed. Of course he noticed. But instead of reacting, he adjusted. Fewer texts, shorter calls. Not as punishment, but as reflection. She pulled back, and he didn't chase. He matched. That's when she started to panic. Because now she wasn't sure if this was just another test, or if she was losing him for real. And the scariest part? She realized he would let her go. Not with anger, with peace. He wasn't a man who feared losing someone. He feared losing himself for someone. There's a difference. He'd done that before. Let love mutate into performance, approval-seeking, identity sacrifice. Not anymore. He had burned in those fires and come out forged. So when the moment came, when she demanded answers without asking questions, when she challenged his affection instead of owning her fear, he didn't fight. He asked her if something was wrong. Once. When she shrugged, he nodded. That was it. No follow-up. No pleading. He gave her space not to manipulate her, but to let her confront herself in it. He had studied people, not academically, but intimately. He knew how silence could be more brutal than shouting. He knew how women, brilliant and broken, could test love by trying to destroy it, just to see if it'd still stand. But he wasn't in the business of proving his worth anymore. He was in the business of protecting his peace. So he stayed, but only as long as presence felt like purpose, not pressure. She didn't understand that kind of love. Most don't, because it's rare. And it's rare because it's rooted in discipline, not desperation. and discipline doesn't flinch when provoked. Then came the argument. Not an explosion, but a quiet storm. She said things she couldn't unsay, measured insults wrapped in sarcasm, designed to cut. He just looked at her, let her speak. When she was done, he said, "I hope that made you feel better." No sarcasm, no retaliation, just stillness. That sentence echoed in her bones. It was worse than shouting, worse than silence. It was clarity, and it left no room for chaos to hide in. She realized he wasn't trying to win the argument. He wasn't even in it. He had outgrown it. In that moment, she understood what it meant to face someone emotionally unshakable. He didn't just understand his emotions, he commanded them, and not in some cold, robotic way. He felt everything, but nothing owned him. Not her moods, not her threats, not the games. He was playing a different game, and the prize wasn't her. It was his peace. That's when she realized she couldn't use fear to make him stay. She couldn't cry her way into control. He saw too much, felt too much. And yet, he stayed calm, not to prove he was right, but to protect what he'd built inside. That night, when she rolled away from him in bed, waiting for his arms to find her like they used to, nothing came. Just stillness, not distance, not rejection. Just a silent reminder that love isn't measured by how fast someone chases when you run, but by how calm they remain when you push. She didn't sleep, because she knew. She had found the one thing she thought she wanted, power, and realized she didn't want it if it meant losing him. But the shift had already begun. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pack a bag. But everything about him said, "I'm not afraid to leave." The morning after was ordinary. Coffee brewed. Sunlight streamed through the curtains. But everything felt wrong. She watched him move. Not cold, not cruel, just distant. Not the kind of distance that invites you to close the gap, but the kind that makes you realize the door is already open, and he might walk through it at any second. She had seen men angry. She had seen men plead. But this was something else. He wasn't mad. He was done. And the scariest part was, he wasn't making a scene. He was making a decision. Quietly. Irreversibly. She thought she had more time. Time to test boundaries, pull back, see if he'd run after her like the others did. But this wasn't that kind of man. He was the lesson she hadn't studied for, the consequence she never saw coming. She replayed their last few weeks, noticing now all the moments he'd shifted, the pauses in conversation, the delayed replies, the emotional exits he took, not because he didn't care, but because he was checking to see if she'd notice. She hadn't. Or worse, she had, and assumed he'd stay anyway. That was her fatal mistake. It wasn't a single fight that undid them. It was erosion. Slow, subtle, and entirely avoidable. But she had underestimated the strength of a man who no longer needed approval. He didn't just have standards, he enforced them. She remembered how she used to admire that about him, until it meant she was now on the other side of that standard. He wasn't leaving out of pride. He was leaving because he refused to lose himself again. And that kind of departure doesn't come with screaming. It comes with silence so profound it echoes louder than any goodbye. She followed him to the doorway, asked where he was going. He looked at her. Not like a lover, not like an enemy, but like a chapter he had finished reading. "I need peace," he said. That was it. No accusations, no begging for her to understand. He didn't owe her an exit. Speech. The man who once shared his every thought now shared only what was essential. And the essential truth was, he had reached his limit. Not in anger, in clarity. He wasn't punishing her. He was protecting himself, and in doing so, he left her, face to face with something terrifying, her own reflection. Suddenly, all the games lost their appeal. The late replies, the sarcastic jabs, the emotional power plays, they all felt childish now. She had been trying to win at something she didn't even understand. And now that she was losing, she finally saw the stakes. She had pushed a man to prove he loved her. And when he didn't flinch, she realized she had made love conditional. And you don't test love like that. Not real love, because real love doesn't beg. Real love watches, waits, then walks when it knows it's no. Longer scene? She cried, of course. Not because he yelled. He didn't. But because he didn't try to comfort her this time. He'd always been the one to hold her when she collapsed under her own weight. This time, he let her feel it. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. He knew what it took to finally grow. Pain that couldn't be ignored. She asked if he'd come back. He didn't answer. He kissed her forehead, once, gently. It wasn't a promise. It was a farewell. A gesture that said, I cared, but I care about me too. And that broke her more than rage ever could. Weeks passed. She kept expecting a text, a call, a moment of weakness. Nothing came. She checked his social media. Nothing posted. No drama, just distance. She heard from friends he was doing well, centered, calm, like a man who had carried a storm for too long and finally put it down. That's when she realized she hadn't lost a boyfriend. She'd lost a mirror. He had reflected back every emotional game she'd ever played and refused to play along. And in doing so, he forced her to confront what she had really been seeking. Control, not connection. Now she sits with that truth. She tells her friends he was too stoic, too distant. But inside, she knows the truth. He was too strong to be broken, and too wise to stay. He didn't ghost her. He didn't block her. He just outgrew her. Not because she was unlovable, but because she didn't love herself enough to meet him where he stood. And when a man loves himself more than your approval, you either rise or you're left behind. She didn't rise. She tested. And she lost. Not to a better woman, but to a better version of him. Some nights she still replays the look in his eyes, the way he stared at her, not with hate, but with history, as if saying, I loved you deeply, but I love my peace more. And she can't unhear that. It hums in the back of her mind, louder than any apology she could now offer. Because the damage wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. He didn't leave her shattered. He left her still whole, but haunted by what could have been if she had chosen to grow with him instead of trying to control him. And that regret, that quiet ache, is the kind that lingers for years. What she lost wasn't just a man. It was a presence. A man whose calm made chaos retreat. A man who didn't argue to be right, but moved to be free. A man who knew his emotions but never weaponized them. She had found a rare thing. A masculine calm wrapped in emotional precision. And instead of learning from it, she tried to bend it. And when it didn't bend, it broke. Free. Now, every man she meets feels loud, reactive, unfinished. And she realizes she didn't just lose love. She lost the version of herself she could have become with him. And that's the story no one tells. Not the story of heartbreak, but of the man who didn't fight to be understood, who didn't yell to be heard, who didn't stay just because she cried, the man who walked away not to punish, but to preserve, and in doing so, became unforgettable. Because in a world full of men reacting to chaos, he was the one who responded with silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of strength. And in that stillness, she heard everything she had refused to listen to before. That's what makes him dangerous. That's what makes him rare. That's what makes him never come back.